A Life Well Lived, the story of D. Ben Rees. Written by D. Ben Rees and narrated by Arnold. Chapter 1. Roots in the Heart of Wales. I was born amidst the rolling hills and beautiful, out-of-this-world valley in the heart of Wales, in a time when the chapel stood taller in a man's life than even the farm, factory, or the mountain. Ours was a world where voices rang out in song before they ever raised themselves in argument, and where the Welsh language was not just a means of communication, but a birthright and a badge of cultural pride. Nearly every soul spoke it. I grew up in a village where everyone knew everyone, and more importantly, where everyone looked out for everyone. It was the kind of place where a coal miner could walk into a butcher's shop and leave with a week's worth of food on trust, knowing he'd settle the bill come payday. Poverty was common, but so was dignity. We lacked money, not purpose. My father was a man of integrity, a worker, and a quiet thinker. He believed in fairness, in discipline, and in doing what was right even when no one was watching. My mother was the soul of our home, a gentle yet fiercely spirited woman who held us together with prayer, tea, and an unshakable belief in the power of education. She could silence a room with a look and uplift it with a hymn. From her, I inherited my love for words, for stories, and for the rhythm of the spoken voice. The chapel played a central role in my early life. It wasn't just a place of worship, it was the heart of our community. I remember sitting on the hard wooden pews, legs dangling, listening to the booming voice of the preacher as if thunder itself had descended into our little stone building. I'd watch, mesmerized, as old men nodded, women hummed, and the organ rose and fell like the very breath of God. That's where I learned that words, when spoken with passion and conviction, could stir the soul. The village school was another story. I wasn't the strongest at arithmetic, but I devoured books and listened with hungry ears. I was especially drawn to the stories of history, Welsh history in particular. I loved learning about Owain Glyndwr, Henry Richard, Sir Owen M. Edwards, and Lloyd George, as well as Aneurin Bevan, not because they were heroes, but because they stood up for something special in our past as well. SS being relevant to our day-to-day living. Even as a boy, I wanted to be one of those people who stood up for a better world. By my teenage years, I felt a calling under my minister, Reverend J.E. Williams, not just to speak, but to serve. I didn't yet know where that calling would take me, but I felt it deep in my bones. In my heart, I knew I was meant for the pulpit. The fire to preach was already kindling inside me, nurtured by chapel meetings, by my mother's singing, and by the soft, firm voice of conscience that seemed to whisper in every quiet moment. Those early years in the valleys shaped everything I would become. They gave me my moral compass, my love for the people, my language, my faith, and an unshakable belief that even a small voice could echo across the hills if it spoke truth. Chapter 2. The Calling of a Young Soul. The calling came not as a thunderclap, but as a whisper, a quiet, steady voice within that refused to be ignored. By the time I was a teenager, I had already spent countless hours within the walls of our chapel. I knew the hymns by heart, the rhythms of revival preaching, the breath between verses. But more than that, I had begun to sense that I was not meant merely to listen. I was meant to speak. It began with small things: a reading during the youth service, a prayer said aloud. And then, one Sunday evening, I was asked to give a short address. A few thoughts, they said, no more than 5 minutes. I prepared with the seriousness of a man facing Parliament. I stayed up late, scribbling notes by candlelight, pacing the living room while the rest of the house slept. And when I stood before the congregation that evening, palms sweating and heart pounding, I felt something shift. The words came, not from the paper but from somewhere deeper. And when it was over, the silence in the room was not awkward, but reverent. That was the moment I knew I was called to preach. Of course, a boy declaring himself destined for the ministry is one thing, but becoming a preacher in Wales was no easy path. The expectations were high, and rightly so. Ministers were expected to be not only scholars, but shepherds of the people, capable of guiding hearts, challenging injustice, and lifting communities with both doctrine and compassion. I threw myself into preparation. Every spare hour was spent reading scripture, theology, philosophy, anything I could find. I was captivated by the old giants Howell Harris, Daniel Rowlands, John Wesley, John Calvin, Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones. But I was also stirred by contemporary voices of conscience, those who spoke out not just for souls, but for society. I began to understand that preaching was not just a spiritual task, it was a social one too. By the time I began my formal studies, I had already participated in a number of Calvinistic Methodist chapel. I would cycle miles through the rain to speak to a congregation of 30 YA in some small rural village, often for nothing more than a cup of tea and a slice of bara Bryth. But I didn't care. Every service was sacred, every pulpit a privilege. During those years, I met fellow students and preachers who challenged me, inspired me, and sometimes drove me to question everything I believed. Faith, after all, is not static. It grows, deepens, is tested. There were moments when I doubted, when I wondered if I was too young, too idealistic, or too stubborn to shoulder the responsibility of spiritual leadership. But in those moments, I returned to the simplicity of my calling. The voice that had spoken to me at the beginning still whispered, "Carry on." My first proper sermon was delivered in a packed chapel one rainy Sunday evening. In South Wales, I remember the old elders on the front row, arms folded, eyebrows raised, not in skepticism, but in expectation. I remember the smell of damp coats and coal smoke. I remember the sound of the rain on the slate roof as I opened my Bible. And I remember the hush that fell over the congregation as I spoke, not because the words were extraordinary, but because they were honest, and came from the soul of a young lad. That night, an elder called David Lloyd approached me and said, "You've got it, lad. Don't let go." I didn't. For nearly 70 years. That chapter of life marked the beginning of a ministry that would stretch far beyond the valleys of Wales. But I carried that early fire with me everywhere I went. The belief that preaching is not about performance, but about purpose. Not about impressing people, but about touching lives. Chapter 3. Preaching and Protesting. To preach is to raise your voice, but to protest is to raise your voice when others would rather you stay silent. In the early days of my ministry, I found that the two, preaching and protesting, were never as far apart as many believed. For me, the gospel was not a set of abstract doctrines to be locked inside 4 chapel walls. It was a living, breathing message for the streets, the factories, the picket lines, and the places where injustice dared to root itself. To speak of love, compassion, and truth on a Sunday, and to ignore the suffering of the poor on a Monday, that to me was a contradiction I could never abide. My first real taste of protest came during the years when apartheid gripped South Africa. I had read the headlines, yes, but it wasn't until I heard Desmond Tutu speak that something cracked open inside me. Here was a man, a preacher like myself, who was not afraid to call racism a sin, and to do so from both the pulpit and the protest march. Inspired, I began to write, to speak out, and to join with others who believed that faith without action was dead. I quickly found myself immersed in causes that cut across class and country. I stood alongside trade unionists fighting for fair pay, students demanding educational reform, and immigrants who had come to Britain seeking dignity but were met with doors slammed in their faces. One memory in particular stands out. I was invited to speak at a rally in Liverpool, my new home by that time, and a city that embraced me with open arms but never let me forget its deep wounds. The crowd was mixed: dock workers, teachers, ministers, and members of the African Caribbean community. I spoke about justice, not from a political platform, but from the example of Christ who overturned tables in the temple and stood with the marginalized. Afterward, a young man approached me. He said, "I've never heard a minister speak like that before. You made me feel seen." That, I thought, was the real work. Of course, not everyone approved. There were those who said a preacher should stay out of politics, as if the world's brokenness could be divided into sacred and secular compartments. But I had seen too much to pretend otherwise. I had seen hungry children in council estates, factory closures that left entire families destitute, and racism dressed up as policy. How could I not speak? I began writing more actively during this time, using pen and pulpit alike to call attention to the great moral crises of our age. My Welsh heritage, my faith, and my passion for justice blended into a voice that, while not always popular, was rooted in conviction. These were also the years when I forged friendships that would shape my life. I worked with fellow ministers who believed as I did, that faith had legs and hands, not just folded arms. I met campaigners and civil rights leaders, some famous, most not, but all carrying the fire of purpose within them. One such friend told me once, "Ben, the difference between a preacher and a prophet is that the preacher comforts the afflicted, and the prophet afflicts the comfortable." I smiled. Then perhaps we must be both. And so I was. Preaching and protesting were never separate callings. Both were rooted in the same command: speak the truth in love. Whether from a pulpit or a pavement, my voice, Welsh lilt and all, was shaped by the conviction that silence, in the face of wrong, is complicity. Chapter 4. The Road to Liverpool. The road to Liverpool wasn't just a change of scenery. It was a turning point, a crossing over into a life of deeper ministry, wider community, and louder witness. When I first stepped foot in that city by the Mersey, I felt as though I had arrived not by accident, but by providence. Liverpool welcomed me with its contradictions, proud yet wounded, rich in history yet burdened by inequality, deeply working class and fiercely intelligent. The docks had shaped its identity, and immigration had given it color, complexity, and a character like no other city in Britain. It was, in many ways, the perfect place for a preacher who had grown up in the valleys and had come to believe that ministry must meet people where they live. I was called to serve at a chapel in one of Liverpool's middle-class districts. The building had seen better days. The walls needed painting, the pews were worn, and the congregation was aging. But the spirit inside it? Alive. That little Welsh chapel was a remnant of a migration story, one of many communities of faith that had sprung up as the children of Wales moved east in search of work. Now, many decades later, it still stood as a spiritual lighthouse for the faithful. I threw myself into the work with energy. Sunday services, midweek meetings, hospital visits, youth gatherings, funerals, weddings. It was a full and fulfilling ministry. But what struck me most was not just what happened inside the chapel walls, but what waited beyond them. The needs of the city were vast: poverty, unemployment, racism, loneliness. And so, I began to walk. I walked the streets, met shopkeepers, knocked on doors, listened to stories. My Welsh accent made me stand out at first, but soon people knew me not as a stranger, but as our minister. Not because of the robe I wore, but because I turned up, I listened, I cared. I also began to realize how much Liverpool and Wales shared: a deep sense of identity, a strong musical and literary culture, and a resilience forged through hardship. I found myself becoming a bridge between the Welsh community and the wider Liverpool population, between the church and the city, between tradition and the modern challenges of a changing Britain. It wasn't long before I became involved in local campaigns and interfaith dialogues. I sat on community boards, helped organize charity drives, and lent my voice to causes that needed a moral anchor. One of the proudest moments of those early years came when I helped establish a forum to bring together leaders from different ethnic and faith backgrounds, a space for unity in a time of division. But Liverpool also gave me something more personal. It gave me a home. The friendships I formed in those years ran deep. I was invited into homes, families, and stories that shaped me as much as any theological book ever could. I shared countless cups of tea, stood by hospital beds, officiated over generations of family events. I was, more than anything else, present. One elderly man once said to me, "You're the first minister I've ever known who came to me before I ever came to you." I carried that with me always. The road to Liverpool was not just a relocation, it was a recommitment to the kind of ministry that listens first, speaks second, and always walks with the people. Chapter 5. Voice of the Welsh in England. Being Welsh in England has always been something more than cultural identity. It's a quiet resistance, a commitment to remembering where you came from while building bridges in a different land. When I moved to Liverpool, I quickly realized how deep the Welsh roots ran in the city. There were Welsh choirs, chapels, societies, and an unspoken understanding between people who, even generations later, still called the valleys home. But while those connections were strong, I also saw something else, a slow erosion of language, of heritage, of voice. The second and third generations were proud of their roots, yes, but many had lost the language, the songs, even the stories, and so I felt another calling rise within me, to be a voice for the Welsh in England, not just a preacher, but a preserver of culture. I began by strengthening the Welsh community right where I was. Our chapel became more than a place of worship. It became a cultural center. We held Simanfaganu, hymn festivals, Welsh language services, poetry readings, and lectures. I encouraged young people to reconnect with their heritage, to ask their grandparents about the old days, to sing the hymns of their forebears. We celebrated St. David's Day each year with both reverence and joy, reminding everyone that being Welsh was not something to be left in history. It was something to be lived. But my work soon took me beyond Liverpool. I began to travel across England, speaking at Welsh chapels in Manchester, London, Birmingham, and beyond. Everywhere I went, I found the same hunger, a longing to belong, to remember, to honor the past while living fully in the present. I wrote articles in Welsh and English, gave interviews, published newsletters, and participated in radio broadcasts, anywhere I could raise the voice of a people who, though scattered, had not forgotten their homeland. Eventually, my work led me to the leadership of various Welsh cultural organizations in England. I helped organize conferences and gatherings that brought together Welsh voices from across the country. We didn't always agree, but we always understood each other. There was something sacred about hearing someone speak Cymraeg in the heart of Manchester, or seeing a teenager recite a Welsh poem in the middle of a city that barely knew the language existed. Some saw this work as a side project, but to me it was ministry. Preserving a people's identity is as holy as preaching a sermon. Culture and faith are woven together like the warp and weft of a tapestry. And when one begins to fray, the whole is at risk. In time, I began writing more formally, books, pamphlets, historical profiles of key Welsh figures who had made their mark in England. These weren't just biographies, they were tributes, reminders, invitations to remember that we stand on the shoulders of those who came before. One of the greatest honors of my life was being recognized as a leading voice of the Welsh diaspora. But more meaningful than the awards were the letters I received. Handwritten notes from elderly Welsh speakers who thought no one remembered them anymore, or young students who had rediscovered their heritage through something I'd written or said. Being a voice for the Welsh in England never meant being louder than others. It meant refusing to let the quiet beauty of a people be forgotten. It meant singing the old songs even when the crowd had turned to something else. It meant remembering always that we are never too far from home. Chapter 6. Activism in the Age of Change. The 1960s and 70s were turbulent decades, but they were also years of awakening. Across the world, old empires were crumbling, civil rights movements were rising, and the conscience of the public was stirring like never before. It was a time of great questioning, and for me, a time of great conviction. Ministry and activism, as I had long come to believe, were not separate pursuits. One demanded the other. If we were to preach justice from the pulpit, we had to pursue it in the public square. And so I stepped into the broader world of activism, not out of ambition, but out of duty. The Vietnam War was raging. South Africa was suffocating under apartheid. Britain itself was grappling with questions of race, class, nuclear arms, and its imperial legacy. As a minister, I could not remain silent. And so I marched. I stood in silent vigils. I signed petitions, wrote pamphlets, and lent my voice to causes that demanded a moral reckoning. One of the movements closest to my heart was the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, CND. The idea that humanity could destroy itself with the push of a button was not just political, it was spiritual. I joined many demonstrations, including some in London, where thousands of ordinary people came together, not in rage, but in hope. We believed that peace was not a fantasy, but a responsibility. I preached peace not only as a political necessity, but as a biblical mandate. Blessed are the peacemakers, after all. Then there was apartheid. I had read the stories, of course, and listened to the testimonies of those who had fled South Africa, but hearing it was one thing. Meeting activists, South Africans, students, ministers, mothers, who had risked their lives for equality, brought the struggle home. I spoke at events across England condemning the regime and calling for boycotts of South African goods and sport. Some called it political interference. I called it the gospel in action. At the same time, I never neglected the local battles. In Liverpool, I stood with striking dock workers, tenants protesting unsafe housing, and immigrants fighting discrimination in the job market. I visited prisons, supported refugee families, and worked closely with community leaders from every background: Catholic, Protestant, Muslim, Jewish, Sikh, and atheist alike. Our unity didn't come from uniformity, but from a shared belief in dignity and justice. Of course, activism came at a cost. There were times when my stance made people uncomfortable, even members of my own congregation. I received letters of support, yes, but also warnings. There were times when I was labeled as too political or too outspoken. But I had long made peace with that. The prophets of Scripture were never welcomed warmly either. What sustained me during those years was not only faith, but fellowship. I worked alongside remarkable people: teachers, nurses, union leaders, students, poets, each of them giving what they had for a better world. Together, we kept going, because the work was not about being seen, it was about being faithful. Looking back, I do not see those years as a detour from ministry, but as the very heart of it. Preaching justice, walking with the poor, speaking truth to power. These were not political acts, they were pastoral ones. And if ever I doubted that, I returned to the words of the prophet Micah. What does the Lord require of you but to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God? Chapter 7. Faith, Fellowship, and Community. If I were to describe my ministry in a single word, it wouldn't be preaching or even activism. It would be community. The heart of faith to me has always been people. Not buildings, not programs, not theology written in marble, but people in all their joy, struggle, and complexity, gathered together by a shared yearning for something greater than themselves. From my earliest days in the ministry, I learned that sermons alone do not build a congregation. It is presence that does. The quiet hospital visit, the knock on a door after a bereavement, the cup of tea after a service, the smile that says, "I see you." Faith, I discovered, grows best in these small moments, moments that make people feel they belong. In Liverpool, I threw myself into community life as deeply as I did into preaching. Our chapel became not just a place of worship, but a home to many. It hosted youth clubs, mother and baby groups, cultural evenings, musical rehearsals, and even political debates. On any given week, you could find a pensioner's lunch on Monday, a Welsh poetry reading on Thursday, and a choir practice echoing through the halls on Saturday night. But what mattered most was that people felt seen. Immigrants, the elderly, single parents, the unemployed, and those simply lonely or lost. They knew they could walk through our doors and be welcomed, not judged. In time, I began working closely with other churches in the city, from Anglican cathedrals to Catholic parishes, from Pentecostal fellowships to Quaker meeting houses. We may have differed in doctrine, but we were united in our calling to serve. Together we ran food banks, organized vigils, and supported refugee resettlement. We sat in rooms together during tense times, when racism flared, when riots broke out, when families were torn apart by poverty, and we asked not what divides us, but what can we do? One of my proudest achievements was helping to form a local ecumenical council, an interchurching fellowship that wasn't just symbolic but practical. We shared resources, held joint services, and spoke with one voice when injustice reared its head. I also regularly met with leaders of other faiths, imams, rabbis, Sikh granthis, because community, I believed, did not stop at the chapel door. If a mosque was attacked, I stood with them. If a synagogue mourned, I mourned with them. Community also meant listening, not solving every problem, not preaching every answer, but listening. One of the hardest things for ministers to do, I've always said, is to be silent. But silence, compassionate, attentive silence, is often the holiest thing we can offer. Over the decades, I was privileged to baptize children, bless marriages, and gently guide families through funerals. I saw generations grow up in front of me, and at every milestone I reminded them, the church is not a building, it is you, it is us. I will never forget the old woman who once took my hand after a midweek service and said, "Thank you, Ben. You make this place feel like family." That, more than any sermon I've preached, is what I treasure most. Community is not always easy. It requires sacrifice, patience, humility, but it is where faith becomes real. It is where heaven touches earth. Chapter 8. Writing as Witness. Long before I ever stood in a pulpit, I loved to write. There was something sacred about the written word, its permanence, its precision, its quiet power to stir thought long after the voice has faded. While preaching gave me the energy of a gathered room, writing offered something deeper: reflection, memory, and legacy. I began writing in earnest during my early ministry, not just sermons, but essays, editorials, and letters to newspapers. At first, it was a way to respond to the issues of the day. I felt compelled to put thoughts onto paper about faith, justice, and the society we were shaping together. But gradually, writing became more than a tool of response. It became a calling in its own right. My first major works were historical. I felt a deep responsibility to preserve the stories of Welsh people, especially those who had lived, worked, struggled, and served in England. So many of their voices were at risk of being forgotten. I wrote biographies of preachers, reformers, pacifists, and poets, figures who had shaped our culture and conscience in quiet, powerful ways. Each book I wrote was a labor of love, often researched in the early hours of the morning or late into the night after pastoral visits were done and the chapel lights were out. I traveled across Wales and England, digging through archives, interviewing descendants, visiting chapels and cemeteries. These were not just academic projects, they were personal pilgrimages. Every name, every story, every lost photograph felt like a thread woven into our national fabric, and I was determined to stitch them back into view. Over the years, I wrote and published more than 30 books, some in English, others in Welsh. Some focused on religious history, others on social movements, and a few even on political thought. Whether the subject was a 19th century preacher or a 20th century peace activist, the heart of each book was the same: bearing witness to lives that mattered. I was often asked why I didn't write more about myself. My answer was always the same: because there are so many others whose stories must come first. I believed then, as I do now, that the best writers shine a light outward, not inward. And yet over time, I came to realize that my own journey, my own witness, was part of that broader story too. Occasionally, I would publish reflections on my ministry, or collections of sermons, or essays on the moral responsibilities of the church in changing times. These writings struck a chord with many, especially in times of national uncertainty. People would write to me, not to debate, but to share how something I'd written had given them hope, clarity, or even the courage to act. That, to me, was the highest compliment. Writing has been the quiet companion of my ministry. It has kept me grounded. It has helped me to process grief and joy, to wrestle with hard questions, to celebrate beauty, and to remember what we so easily forget. And perhaps most importantly, writing has allowed me to leave something behind. Not just books on shelves, but a trail of memory, thought, and witness that I pray will continue to speak long after I'm gone. Chapter 9. The People I Have Met. If my life has been a journey, then the greatest treasures along the way have been the people, each one a lesson, a blessing or a challenge. Some were known across the world, others were known only to their neighbors, but each, in their own way, left their mark on me. I have had the privilege of meeting individuals whose names carry weight in the public consciousness: preachers, poets, politicians, peacemakers. One of the most profound encounters of my life was with the Archbishop Desmond Tutu. His voice was not loud in volume, but it carried the moral clarity of thunder. We spoke of apartheid, justice, forgiveness, and I remember thinking that here was a man who did not just preach the gospel but became it. I also crossed paths with Welsh giants of faith and literature, people who carried the soul of our nation in their pens and pulpits. I admired them not only for their eloquence, but for their commitment to truth. Whether in the rugged cadence of a sermon or the beauty of a well-wrought poem, they stirred something in me that never left. But the most unforgettable people in my life have often been the ones the world never noticed. There was the old elder who never missed a service, even when his legs could barely carry him. He once told me, "Ben, faith isn't always fire. Sometimes it's just turning up." He was right. There was the single mother who raised 4 children on a cleaner's wage and still found time to volunteer at the chapel every week, smiling as though the world hadn't bruised her. And the young man who came to me after a sermon and said he didn't believe in God but wanted to help people. "Is that enough?" he asked. "It's more than enough to start," I told him. There were countless elders, pillars of quiet strength, who taught me about faithfulness, dignity, and perseverance without ever standing behind a lectern. Their stories didn't make headlines, but they lived the gospel with every step. And of course I met many fellow ministers, some brilliant, some broken, most a mix of both. We shared struggles and laughter, loneliness and joy. We buried each other's congregants and sometimes each other's doubts. In those friendships I found a kind of brotherhood that only those who have carried the weight of souls can understand. My travels also introduced me to people from every faith and walk of life. Muslim imams who invited me to their homes during Ramadan, Jewish rabbis who welcomed me to Sabbath meals, Sikh community leaders who showed me what service looks like in action. These encounters reminded me again and again that the divine often speaks in languages we don't expect. Even the briefest encounters left impressions. A homeless man outside a railway station once asked me not for money but for a prayer. I sat beside him, and we prayed in the cold, surrounded by footsteps and passing eyes. When we finished, he said, "I knew you'd stop. You're a man of words, but you listen too." That, I thought, might be the highest compliment I've ever received. The people I've met have been the greatest part of this journey. Their faces return to me in quiet moments. Their words echo through my memory. Some are gone now, their names etched in my notebooks and in my prayers, but all of them, famous or forgotten, have built the mosaic of my life. Chapter 10. My beloved Wales. Wales has never been just a place to me. It is the sound of my first breath, the rhythm of my earliest thoughts, the music of my memories. Even when I have lived far from its hills and valleys, Wales has never left me. It is stitched into the fabric of my voice, my faith, my soul. I was born and raised in a Wales where the chapel still echoed with hymns and the kitchen still smelled of caul. Ours was a nation of song and sermon, of hard work and high ideals. We knew what it meant to be poor in pocket but rich in spirit. We had little in material things but much in community, tradition, and story. The Welsh language, Cymrig, was my cradle tongue. It's a language that does not rush. It lingers, it sings. To speak Welsh is to inherit something ancient, something that binds you to a people, to a landscape, to a struggle that has lasted for centuries. It has always been my mission to keep it alive, both in my writing and in my voice, whether in Liverpool or London. I've written often of Wales, because I could never tire of it. Its preachers, poets, reformers, miners, teachers, all ordinary and extraordinary at once. Wales taught me that faith and justice go hand in hand, that culture is a form of resistance, and that memory is a kind of protest against erasure. Some of my fondest memories are tied to small village chapels with names barely visible on faded signs. I remember the chill of early morning meetings, the heat of summer revivals, the thrill of a voice lifted in spontaneous praise. I remember how Sunday best was not about appearance, but about honor. Honor for the place, the time, and the God we served. And of course, there were the Eisteddfodau, festivals of culture, poetry, music, and pride. There is nothing quite like a Welsh crowd holding its breath as a bardic chair is announced, or the electric joy of a choir in full harmony under the tented sky. I have stood at many a microphone at these festivals, trying not only to represent our past, but to encourage our future. Yet Wales is not without its sorrows. I have watched with grief as chapels closed, as rural communities shrank, as young people left for the cities and the old certainties faded. I have mourned the loss of our language in some places, and the dilution of our identity in others. But even in this mourning, I have found resolve. Because Wales endures. It endures in the voices of our singers, in the stubborn hope of our writers, in the grit of our workers. It endures in the echo of a prayer said softly in a kitchen, and in the old lady who still knits in Welsh and hums the hymns of her childhood. I have spent decades away from Wales, but I've never stopped loving her. I have spoken of her across England, written about her in book after book, and defended her honor when others misunderstood. I have stood in her defense not with anger, but with affection. And whenever I return, whether to the green of Snowdonia, the wild winds of the coast, or the quiet gray of the valleys, I feel the same thing I did as a boy. Peace. Not silence, but peace. The kind of peace that comes from knowing who you are and where you belong. Wales is my beginning. Wales will always be my eternal home in the quiet cemetery of Llandewi Brefi, near to graves of my parents and my Auntie Ray and Uncle Ben, not forgetting my mother's family, as swell as my father's brother Evan Rees, who sailed the seas of the world for 40 years. Chapter 11. The Power of the Pulpit. There is a sacred weight to standing in a pulpit, not because of the height or the view, but because of what it represents. A trust placed in you by a community, and a call placed on you by something higher. From the very beginning of my ministry, I have never taken that place lightly. The pulpit at its best is not a stage, it is not a pedestal, it is a meeting place between God and the people, between the Word and the world. It is where broken hearts listen for healing, where doubting minds seek clarity, and where weary souls come hoping to be lifted. I've stood in many pulpits, in grand city churches and humble rural chapels, in echoing cathedrals and cold community halls. And while each setting had its own beauty, the power of the pulpit never came from architecture, it came from authenticity. Preaching to me has never been about performance. I've never cared for theatrics or polished perfection. I believe in honesty. I believe in speaking from the heart, and to the heart. Whether I was preaching to 10 or 100, I always reminded myself, someone here needs this today. That was enough. Some sermons came with fire, righteous anger at injustice, a cry for compassion, a call to action. Others were quiet, reflective, rooted in gentleness. I've preached on grief and hope, peace and protest, faith and doubt. I've spoken words at weddings where joy burst from every pew, and words at funerals where silence held more meaning than any sermon. One moment I'll never forget was during a Good Friday service in Liverpool. The chapel was full. Outside, the world rushed by. Cars, rain, life as usual. Inside, there was stillness. I spoke on the final words of Christ. It is finished. As I spoke, I saw tears fall. Not dramatic, just honest. Afterward, a man came up and said, "You helped me understand that even endings can be sacred." That was the sermon's purpose. Not to impress, but to touch. The greatest compliment I've ever received as a preacher wasn't, "That was brilliant," but "That helped." That, to me, is the purpose of the pulpit. To help people live, love, grieve, and carry on. But the pulpit is also a place of courage. There have been times when I've spoken truths that were unpopular. about war, about racism, about poverty and power. I've preached sermons that made people shift in their seats. But I always believed that if a sermon comforts the comfortable and never challenges them, then it is incomplete. I learned early on that preaching is not just what you say, it's how you live. The best sermons are backed by the life of the one who speaks them. That's why I've always tried to live in such a way that my actions and my sermons were in harmony. I haven't always succeeded, but I've tried. And that trying, I believe, is part of the calling. Even now when I walk into a chapel and see the pulpit standing there, wooden, familiar, worn, I feel the same humility I felt all those years ago. Not fear, not pride, but reverence. Because that place, raised though it may be, is not above the people. It is among them. And it will always be to me a sacred space. Chapter 12. Looking back, pressing on. As I sit and reflect on a life shaped by faith, filled with people, and grounded in purpose, I feel no desire for grandeur, only gratitude. I look back on decades of ministry, not as a list of accomplishments, but as a series of relationships, each one a holy encounter. From the unique villages in Ceredigion, university town of Aberystwyth, the valleys of Wales to the streets of Liverpool, from chapels to lecture halls, from peace marches to quiet hospital rooms, my life has been stitched together by a simple thread: service. I have never claimed to have all the answers. In truth, much of my life has been shaped by questions about faith, about justice, about how best to live with compassion in a complicated world. But through those questions, I have found meaning. And meaning, I believe, is more valuable than certainty. Age brings a quieter kind of wisdom. I no longer rush to speak as I once did. I listen more. I notice the things I once passed by: the kindness of strangers, the silence between words, the sacredness of ordinary moments. I look at younger generations not with criticism, but with hope. I see in them a passion for change, for inclusion, for authenticity, and I believe the church and the world are in capable hands, so long as they are guided by love and truth. There is still so much to do. Injustice has not vanished. The need for kindness, for courage, for moral clarity remains. But I have learned that we do not carry the world alone. We do our part, then pass the baton, and trust. If I could leave a message for those who come after me, it would be this: live with conviction, but carry humility. Speak truth, but always in love. Honor your heritage, but keep your arms open to the world. And never, ever underestimate the power of compassion. It changes more than policy or doctrine ever could. To my beloved Wales, I say, hold fast to your language, your music, your culture, your working-class story. You are a small nation with a great heart. The world needs that heart now more than ever. To my fellow ministers who are getting small, astonishing talented teachers and writers, keep planting seeds, even if you never see the harvest. The pulpit, the page, and the protest still matter. Be faithful, not flashy. And to those who have shared the journey with me, my devoted wife Meinwin, my two sons Dafydd and Hefin and their wives Katie and Bethan, the grandsons Tomos and Joshua, the Benjamin and Reese families, friends, congregants, colleagues, I thank you. You have made my life worthwhile and my calling meaningful. I don't know how many more chapters are left to write, but I know that even as the pace slows, the purpose remains. There is still prayer to be offered, still people to love, still books to be written and poems and songs to be published in our local community papers. I press on, gently now in my late 80s, but gladly, and I do so with joy.